Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Singapore Pavilion. So for our Energy and Decarbonization Day today, we are having a panel on affordable energy transition in emerging Asia. So without further ado, may I now invite Keith Lim, Director of Sustainability and Public Affairs from Temasek, to give a short opening.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Keith. I'm from Temasek. For those of you, I see a lot of... sorry. Can we go back to the first slide? Yeah. I see a lot of new faces here, so welcome to the Singapore Pavilion. Just want to introduce the panel, but before that, just a quick spiel and introduction to Temasek. Some of you may be familiar with us. We are a global investment company headquartered in Singapore. We were incorporated in 1974. So this year we celebrated our 50th anniversary. We are owned but not directed by the Singapore government, which is quite different from what you would understand of a typical sovereign wealth fund. And our net portfolio value as of 31st March, which is the annual year-end closing, was just south of US $300 billion. Important distinction is although we are owned by the Singapore government, we manage off our own assets. We are an active owner and investor, and we invest off our own balance sheet. Right? We do not take capitalization from the government as additional financing for our investment deployment. So everything is through our own balance sheet. And we are global, truly global in nature. We have 13 offices, around 1,000 staff. And you may wonder sort of what do we have to do with sustainability, and sort of purpose really runs and emanates through our firm. We believe, and this is our purpose statement. Sorry, it's a bit soft, so I don't know whether if everybody can hear me, but it's good. So, our purpose statement is so every generation prospers, and this speaks to our long-term investment mandate. We are in sustainability for the long haul. It ties to the fact that we are looking to build a long-term oriented portfolio with resilient and long-term returns. And hence, we believe that sustainability and the pursuit of sustainability is core and integral to what we do as a firm and what we invest in. So we have been making strategic investments into sustainability. Sustainable living is one of our 4 key investment trends. And as of year-end closing this year, we have invested about $44 billion into sustainability-aligned investments. And we broadly categorize these into 2 components. The first are sustainability-focused investments, and these are companies with products and services that contribute towards our long-term vision of net zero, nature positivity, and inclusive growth. And you'll see some of the focus areas across, we have 7 focus areas that we are actively investing in. Now the second are what we call climate transition investments. And these make up the remaining $6 billion of the $44 billion. Examples of investments in these categories are businesses in high-emitting sectors that we are looking to actively transition, right, them to products and services that will contribute towards our climate objectives. And you'll see some examples of companies that we invest in are a part of our portfolio on the slide. Just very quickly, we have what we call a 3-pronged decarbonization strategy. And given that we are invested in the real economy, it is a key part of being able to, besides investing into new assets, which is what we described in the earlier slide, we are making active efforts to encourage and promote decarbonization efforts in our existing portfolio companies, a lot of which are based in Singapore. So a good example is we are a major portfolio owner or investor and owner of Singapore Airlines. So that's aviation, which as we know is a hard-to-abate sector, and I'm sure we have some discussions around that later. But also, we actively promote and encourage and enable carbon market solutions. We have a platform called Gen Zero, which we have parked aside $5 billion to be able to catalyze carbon markets and carbon enablers. And our net zero ambition remains clear, and we are committed towards it of achieving net zero. An ambition of achieving net zero by 2050 with the intention of halving our net zero targets by 2030 based on 2010 baseline levels. One thing that really sort of differentiates us is that we have embedded a notional internal carbon pricing into our investment decisions. And so that cost of carbon is factored into every single investment decision that we make. And this is currently standing at $65 with the expectation that we increase this to $100 by the turn of the century. And we encourage and we work with our portfolio companies based on where we can maximize our impact. So we have engaged about 19 of our major portfolio companies on their decarbonization journeys. 11 of the 19 which comprise about 85% of our net zero of our emissions, do have 2050 targets, and we continue to engage these companies. I want to sort of call out, especially here when we are at COP, that we are really actively looking to collaborate with like-minded partners across the capital stack to drive systems-level change. And so we form strategic partnerships to build capabilities and deploy capital across different growth stages. Example will be our partnership with Breakthrough Energy and Enterprise Singapore to establish the first Breakthrough Energies Fellows, right, program outside of the US in Southeast Asia and the ambition is to bridge the capabilities gap in climate tech innovation and scale solutions in the region. Yesterday, if you were here, you would also be hearing a lot of exciting news about our partnership with the Monetary Authority of Singapore on scaling blended finance through the FAST-P, or Financing Asia's Transition Partnerships platform, where we are dedicating catalytic capital to be able to drive scaling up of marginal bankable projects, climate projects in Southeast Asia. And happy to speak a bit more about that separately after this discussion. On the convening front, we also have a sustainability conference, which some of you may be aware. It's called Ecosperity. We convene sort of like-minded stakeholders across public, private, and non-governmental sectors once a year in Singapore. This is the 10th year that we're convening this platform, and I think we're quite encouraged to see that it's become a bit of a barometer to take stock of the sustainability agenda in Southeast Asia and sort of what makes sense and it's relevant for businesses as we work towards collective net zero goals. So this is just a quick snapshot of our Ecosperity conference, which took place earlier this year, where we had our milestone edition. We drew about 3,000 participants, 60% from Asia, but 40% rest of the world. The split, in terms of split, 60% was private sector, 30% was public, and 10% was from non-governmental sectors. And more importantly, we had 20 partners come together to organize strategic events on the sidelines of Ecosperity Week to collectively translate discourse, and commitments into action. And just my last slide before we segue to the panel. Please save the date. If you happen to be in Singapore, you plan to be around the region come May 2025, please join us at Ecosperity 2025. Our theme for the conference next year is Asia's Race Towards 2030, All Systems Go. And this really speaks to, we believe, the need and the impetus for businesses and governments to look at immediate steps to be able to address targets, the 2030 targets, in order for us to stand a chance of bending the emissions curve as we work towards 2050. So please join us if you happen to be in Singapore. With that, without further ado, I just want to segue to our panel, and we'll be talking today about how do we make the energy transition in Southeast Asia an affordable and accessible one. We have a stellar cast, and I will invite our moderator, Francisca, my very esteemed colleague, who directs our sustainability and climate change strategy at Temasek, to the stage, and she will introduce the rest of our panelists, and if we can have everybody join us on stage here for the introductions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Keith, and I think we're ready to get this conversation started. All systems go for us as well. Let me maybe just quickly set the stage. We are talking about emerging markets here in Asia, and as we know, it's a very dynamic region. We're still a growth region in Asia, meaning that we grow economically but there's also still development that is happening. So our energy demand is actually increasing across the region. And we are projecting that Southeast Asia alone will take 25% of the energy growth over the next decade. That's second to India, so we have a couple of different regions within Asia that will be driving the future growth of the energy demand. At the same time, many of the countries still rely on fossil fuels today. Of course, renewable energy is a key promise for us, but it cannot be scaled up quickly enough. We are projecting that perhaps renewable energy can come up to 35% of this annual growth, but it cannot be covering all of the additional electricity that is required. At the same time, I think there's glimmers of hope. Technology cost has come down, both in the renewable energy side. In many of the markets, renewable energies are more affordable than the conventional sources of energy. But there's also other technologies that are more downstream that have become very affordable and very attractive to the consumers. So our conversation today really focuses on how can we move faster? How can we get those technology to the consumer? How can we change the whole system along the way so that we can decarbonize emerging Asia as fast as we can? And it's my great pleasure today to have a stellar team here on board. We have Suleiman Ba, who is the partner and co-head of climate strategy at Leapfrog Investments. We have Vijay Chandrasekhar, who is the co-founder and CEO of Cosmos Innovation. Dr. Bertrand Picard, the founder and chairman of the Solar Impulse Foundation. And Kelvin Tan, the managing director and head of sustainability and government affairs for ASEAN, but also a board member of Pentagreen Capital. So with this, let us dive directly into the discussion, and I'm turning to you first, Vijay. As we've heard, solar energy is at the core of what we might be able to achieve, right, of all the decarbonization pathways. Currently, about 95% of the solar cells worldwide are made with silicon as a common semiconductor material, but however, studies have shown that there's limits to what silicon can deliver. The cell's efficiency would reach its limit at 27%, putting sort of a hard cap on what solar can actually contribute in terms of decarbonization. So can you provide a bit of a perspective on what we can do beyond this?
Thanks, Francisca. Yeah, absolutely. I think solar has probably a really important role to play in the energy transition. I think by some counts, it's going to power half the world's electricity. It's the fastest, easiest way to deploy energy globally. But again, as you mentioned, the big pain point is all the solar that you see today is all built in silicon, which is sort of reaching its fundamental limits in efficiency, which is the amount of sunlight to convert to electricity, right? So what's next is what we're building at Cosmos Innovation. So we're building a technology called perovskite silicon tandem, where we're layering a new class of materials called perovskites on top of silicon, which essentially enables capturing a broader portion of the spectrum, allowing us to massively increase the efficiency of the solar cell without increasing cost too much. So this is the start of a brand new S-curve in solar, and I think what I also want to emphasize is I think the urgency of the problem, right? I think the rate of climate change is accelerating. I think building some of these new technologies can take a very, very long time, right? And I'll give you maybe an example of the blue LED, right? So a semiconductor, solar is a type of semiconductor, right? The red LED and the yellow LEDs were invented in 1971, but it took another 20 years before the blue LED showed up, right? I mean, now today we have silicon. We can't wait another 20 years to get this new semiconductor built, perovskite silicon tandem. So the important piece of the puzzle is then the urgency for building these new technologies, and we believe AI has a very critical role to play in sort of accelerating the development of these new technologies, right? So all in all, I would say I think solar has probably the most exciting growth path forward. I think we need to go beyond silicon, and I think we need to use the most advanced technologies we can to sort of accelerate this energy transition.
This is fascinating, and I think we're all very excited about some of the technology developments. But when we hear these high technology innovations, right, everybody is thinking, oh my God, this stuff is expensive. Now, Sule, you and Leapfrog, you've been in the markets for 16 years, emerging markets, you know these markets like almost nobody else. And at the same time, we feel, are these technologies really ready to be deployed in emerging markets? Do you have a perspective on this?
Thanks, Francesca, and also just thanks Temasek and Singapore for really bringing the community together. Because actually what you have here first is really an ecosystem, right? You have Bertrand who inspires us, Vijay does the science and cracks the code. We focus on how do you take that new technology to take it to your home, so it's part of your life, and Kelvin supercharges that transition through their balance sheet, right? So really you have an ecosystem together, and thanks for bringing us together. So your question is, are these new technologies too expensive and not accessible? And the answer actually is that there are many situations here, especially in energy, where actually the lower carbon solution is cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. And that's what we call the green discount, which is we look at the levelized cost of solar or renewable. In many markets, the solar solution is cheaper than the incumbent. And I think that's really a great motivator for customers to adopt, and also has a multiple benefits to actually countries as a nation, because a place like India spends billions of dollars a year importing gas and refined products. But by using renewable energy, it saves them a lot of forex reserves, which they can spend in other priorities for the country. So it's not just about saving money for the end consumer, it's about actually saving dollars to nations. So I think it's a win-win between the customer, the country, and the planet, right? So that makes it a trifecta. But now the question is, if that's so true, how come it's not everywhere? And the challenge is not that it is more expensive. The challenge is it has a higher upfront cost. The big challenge we have in this transition is you're moving from a world where you had, when you look at the example of a coal plant. Over the life of a coal plant, the cost of that plant, if you divide it by the life of that plant, is actually small on a price per kilowatt hour basis. But every year you spend a lot of money to fuel that coal or to buy that gas. So you have low capex, upfront capex, but high annual OPEX. When you go to the transition, that's flipped. You're going from an environment where you have very high upfront costs. You're going to build that solar plant upfront, but then every year the running cost is very low. So the challenge you have is you're going from a world I call was a pay-as-you-go world. You spend most of the money as you use it over time, to a world where it says pay a lot upfront and you get the benefit in the future. So the question is, how do you create that transition and lower that barrier to adoption? And I call it that this is where now you go from the science innovation to business model innovation. And I call it, for example, bite-sized infrastructure. Instead of building a multi-gigawatt solar plant, you can do distributed infrastructure, which is you do it at 10 megawatts at a time, 50 megawatts at a time. That makes it more affordable to the customer. You also have new business models as what I call energy as a service. So across markets, what you're seeing now is you have companies that come to a customer and say, look, I'll give you the solar panel, I'll give you the lighting, I'll give you the television, I'll give you the fridge. You don't pay upfront, but you're going to pay every day through your mobile phone, pay as you go, which is what you have today at home, which is you pay your bills as you use them. So it's about how do you change this upfront cost and make it bite-sized so the customer gets the benefit every day without the high upfront cost. And so what does it mean? You're going to go from developing the technology to having business model innovation and financial innovation. And there's a massive opportunity in that space.
You gave me the right clue to then turn to Kelvin and say, well, we have business model innovation that we know is required, but also financial innovation. And I know you're looking at Southeast Asia every day. You're thinking about this energy transition every day and how do we finance it. So any perspectives from you, Kelvin?
Yeah, thank you very much, Francesca, and great to be here. I think from emerging markets, and particularly in Southeast Asia, the elephant in the room really is how we actually transition from fossil fuel into renewables, right? And I'll start with the good news first. The good news is that we are trying to crack the code, and there are like-minded people coming together actually to do this. So just give you a few examples. For example, last year, GFANS, alongside with a lot of banks like HSBC, we came out with this thing called the managed coal phase-out, because coal actually is the largest producer of carbon emissions when it comes to power in Southeast Asia. And a lot of banks actually and financial institutions are actually shying away from coal because we all have our commitments not to have to finance any new coal. So how then do we come across and basically try to overcome this issue? So GFANs and financial institutions came together, and we provide a few guidelines. It's available in GFAN's website, where it actually says that what are the guardrails, what are some of the things that additionality, the leakages that we need to be mindful of, and to look forward basically to say that how financial institutions then can come to finance transitions of coal. Right? So it's a forward-looking transaction rather than saying that we just cannot finance coal. Because in Southeast Asia, where energy is very important, I think it's important to also recognize that banks need to finance these smooth transitions. The other example is yesterday at the Singapore Pavilion, MES, under the auspice of MES, we launched something called Traction, which is transition credits. Because when you basically retire coal, there is actually a cost to pay. Unfortunately, the coal power plant in this part of the world, and the average age is about 15 years. So, the economic lifespan is very great, and somebody has to pay when you want to early retire this coal, right? So there's a need now to look at innovative financial instruments. So we thought about having transition credits to do this. The third example is really the people coming together is JETP, which is Just Energy Transition Partnership, where you have the G7s and a few financial institutions coming together to provide public-private sector funding or blended financing to try and solve some of these issues. And JETP is being signed in Indonesia and in Vietnam to specifically look at to see how we can transition out of fossil fuels, right? I'll just end off by saying that these are all the positive things that we're working on, but the negative things that there's still a lot of challenges when it comes to energy transition in this part of the world. One big issue, obviously, is the fact that when you look at it, these projects are still not scalable because Asia in itself and Southeast Asia is not a homogeneous, platform, right? There's a lot of regulatory issues which faces every single country. So there's not, at the moment, a one-size-fit-all solution to doing that. The other issue is that, whilst you have solar and renewables there, which actually is very viable in this part of the world, the issue, of course, is the infrastructure. We need to look at, see when you transition into this, what sort of infrastructure then, who's going to finance them, the grid system, or even when you talk about EVs, introducing EV cars, who's going to pay for the charging stations and things like that. So these are some of the things that we need to take note of. So the technology is there, it's great, but I think there's still a lot of challenges. And the final point about challenge in particular in the emerging market is the just transition part of it. So if we just shut down coal, there'll be about 6.7 million people who will be impacted by coal in terms of just the job security, right? How then do you retrain them and to make sure that there's a smooth transition? Apart from the fact that you need to also make sure that any renewable energies and all that is as affordable and there's energy security. So these are some of the challenges that we face. But as many of the institutions here, the good news is that we are all coming together to come and find solutions to overcome these challenges. And I think it's a good thing we are in COP, and I feel relatively positive, that there will be solutions. And it's good that we have innovators here to provide the solutions.
Yeah, and it's in a way also interesting to see we don't just need money to sort of support innovations and scale them up, but actually also money to make sure we get away from the old ways of doing things, right? And so that transition needs to be seamless from how we've been doing things previously to how can we do things in the future. And before I come to you, Bertrand, I just want to build on it and get Vijay to comment on the scale-up of technology, because I think you mentioned there's ample money there to help support innovation as it, sort of gets around building the technology, but bringing that technology to market, actually building manufacturing capacity and so forth, that's more challenging. Would you like to comment on that as well?
Absolutely, and I think, before, let's say, we can get someone like Suleiman to fund us for a new technology, there's a long path ahead for us, and I think fundamentally what we see are two critical valleys of death. So in the world of climate tech, there are a range of next-gen technologies, right? It's next-gen solar, next-gen batteries, there's electrolyzers, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, etc., right? So these technologies typically go through a long cycle where they start off in early R&D. Then you build what's called your first pilot line, which is where you demonstrate manufacturability for the very first time. And then you build your first scaled up facility, what's called your first of a kind gigafactory or your first of a kind scaled up facility that manufactures at scale and proves the techno-economic analysis or the profitability early profitability at scale, right? And I think building the first pilot line and building that first scaled up facility are two critical valleys of death for any company that's building next gen technology here. Before we can go to folks like Solomon who'll write checks for the nth of a kind, right? So a first of a kind has to be navigated for each of these. And at each step, I think it is a complex path forward because there is a significant supply-demand mismatch of capital in these early stages because that venture capital chases easier returns in things like software or other areas which are not as difficult as climate tech. And I think that's where I think governments have a key role to play because unlike software, right? Let's say you think you're building OpenAI, it's a few hundred engineers sitting in Silicon Valley who capture most of the value, right? I think for a range of climate technologies that I talked about, I think the value capture is highly distributed, right? Because there will be domestic supply chains for a lot of these technologies as well. And there's local value capture, and I think that's where I think sovereigns and sovereign wealth funds can play a very important role earlier in this life cycle, taking on some of that risk, not only to push these technologies into the market, but also to anchor sort of the supply chains of the future locally, right? And I think it's fascinating to see how these things are going to get played out in the next 5-10 years. But I think it's going to be a complex set of blended finance that's going to transition that's going to be needed to transition from that early venture capital on before we can eventually get to like private equity.
So we need to think bigger. We need to think about the economic opportunity around some of those technologies and possibilities that we have and be able to really align everything. Let me now turn to Bertrand. And for those of you who don't know Bertrand, he's an innovator, and I think innovation is part of his DNA. He comes from a family of innovators. He's been flying the first solar plane around the world, but also has his fingers on the pulse with many other clean technology innovations and solutions through the Solar Impulse Foundation. So Bertrand, you have also obviously worked with governments, with private sector, with everybody in the value chain. Do you have sort of also an experience on what it takes to create that pool of solutions and bring those solutions to the market? I know for you also trust is an important element.
I think when we speak about solutions, we have to define what is economically profitable to protect the environment and what is not. What is not profitable today to protect the environment, like green hydrogen, for example, still needs research, needs to reach the critical mass, needs subsidies, needs philanthropy before it can be profitable. But what we have been doing at the Solar Impulse Foundation is to identify already 1,700 solutions in every sector, every field, that are already existing, already economically profitable, and already able to protect the environment. And we see that we are hitting a limit, which is exactly what Suleiman was explaining so well. You were outstanding when you were explaining the principle of servitization. That means, how do you overcome the upfront investment to bypass the ownership and sell the use of the solution instead of the ownership? And it's interesting that I can answer you directly that yesterday we launched an initiative with the European Commission and the European Investment Bank to create this financial tool that will allow to bypass this problem of ownership and upfront investment. So we have a pilot initiative for a year, and the goal afterward is to open it to banks, to institutions, to whoever wants to come in the blended finance. So the owner, or let's say the producer of a solution, for example, to reabsorb the heat that is lost in the chimney of a factory, the producer of that system can come directly to the client and say, we install it for free. And we have the financial instrument who will pay for the investment and will recover the money on the savings that you do every day. So we can give access to everybody to these solutions. And it has another positive effect. It's the fact that you can shift from the quantitative economy, where the goal is to sell more and more cheap and bad quality that has to be replaced all the time, shift to a qualitative economy, where you have to avoid planned obsolescence, where you have to produce quality, because otherwise you have to change the system all the time. It's not the customer who's going to pay for it if it's bad quality. You know, it's the owner. It's the guy who's producing it. So you have a triangle in which you allow the world to become efficient and to change this paradigm of production. Because if you've noticed, we have been, since the beginning, only speaking about production. The limit of production for solar panels or other type of production solutions. But the production of energy will never be enough in the world to replace fossil fuels if we did not reduce the consumption by being efficient. And energy efficiency is the second leg on which we have to work. Renewables, of course, but efficiency in terms of reducing the consumption. And you were talking, Francesca, about the solar-powered airplane. It's exactly what we had to do. The aeronautical industry told me you can never have a solar-powered airplane that will fly around the world, flying day and night on solar power, because the sun is not producing enough energy for that, the limit of solar power. And of course, you cannot increase the power of the sun, switch it higher, but you can decrease the consumption of the airplane by making it more efficient. And that's how we did it. This is why this plane had huge wings, was very light, was flying slowly. And at the end, we flew around the world with this plane at the speed of a moped and the power of a moped. A small motorcycle, 60 horsepower. And we have this airplane flying day and night. So let's work on production, yes, to be renewable, but let's work on efficiency so we really don't need to install as much production, because we will save on the consumption side, and with servitization, we'll make it affordable to all, including the developing countries, because the investment will be profitable.
And this is an important point, Bertrand, for sure. And I think we all need to focus on both sides of the equation. I'm conscious of time, and I know Kelvin will have a hard stop at 3 or 4:30. So I want to make sure that you also can stay part of this conversation for our last few bits. And we've been talking about how it requires broader systems thinking on some of those solutions. And we know that in order to be able to deliver some of those solutions to the customers, we need infrastructure, right? So it's not just about having, EVs, having electric two-wheelers, being able to harness solar for this, but it's also about somebody needs to invest in infrastructure. And you've been a JV partner with Temasek in Pentagreen Capital, and I thought maybe you would want to come in a bit and talk about Pentagreen Capital.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so the genesis of Pentagreen Capital, which I think there was an announcement made on Tuesday, is that HSBC and Temasek came together now almost, say, about 5 years ago, to say that there is actually a gap in financing when it comes to transition, and in particular sustainable infrastructure financing, because there are deals that may be viable, but because they are greenfield projects and all that, which banks do not want to go in, or maybe the tenor are too long, or maybe the size is actually not big enough for banks to want to come in to do project financing of sorts. So Temasek and HSBC started Pentagreen as a proof of concept to see whether there's really a demand for this. And most importantly, Pentagreen is supposed to bring in capital that will be catalytic. So we are supposed to look at marginally bankable transactions, but viable transactions, put in these funding into them to kind of mitigate some of the risks that may be facing these projects. And with the mitigations, for example, if you put in a mass transaction debt into it, then they will bring in and crowd in more senior capital debt, because the underlying risk will be mitigated. So since the inception of Pentagreen, we did 2 transactions. There's one transaction in the Philippines, which is a greenfield solar project, and another is actually a portfolio of bioenergy projects in Indonesia and Vietnam. The good news is that we are now scaling Pentagreen up. And on Tuesday, Pentagreen will be part of the FAST-P project, which the Singapore government has committed to, where they will be contributing up to 500 million of concessionary funding. And this is what really blended financing comes to life with. So what Pentagreen will do is that they will actually manage a fund called the Green Investments Partnership. And with that, we will have different capital stacks. Concessionary funding that will be provided by the Singapore government and a few other institutions. You have the mass financing and the senior financing, and that will be blended together to make sure that this is a powerful tool. See, what we need actually is a platform where we'll look at projects to scale up, rather than looking at it from a project-by-project basis, because that's very time-consuming and it's not replicable, right? So I think that's the intention of what Pentagreen is trying to do. And and we are very hopeful because we've launched it on Tuesday, and I think we'll just scale that up.
Great, and I think it's very important to understand, right, that it requires different pools of capital, different approaches, but also make the holistic aspect work. Sule, I know with your investments, you're targeting very specific sectors, right? And you've been identifying mobility, food, energy, but also mobility, right, as and the built environment as priority sectors. Can you maybe share a little bit more why those sectors are the most promising ones for you?
Thank you. I think I'll build on actually Bertrand's point, which is there are some sectors where you have reached the tipping point when the solution is already economic and you can scale it. And in those 4 sectors, we see many of the subsectors where you already have that economic viability, especially what I call the green discount. So our view is this, if you want people to be part of the transition, we say, well, it's easy to catch flies with honey than vinegar, right? If you're saving people money, they'll make the switch. So the question is, on these 4 sectors, where can you save people money? So in energy, so distributed energy with solar and renewables, especially when you think about it as energy as a service model, I think it's a very compelling proposition. The second area is in transportation, in mobility. And when you look at in Asia, actually, the transition is not taking place from the top down. It's not from the Tesla down. It's taking place first actually from the 2 and 3-wheelers up. Why? That's what most people use, and affordability is a challenge. Similar to the energy space, what you have as a challenge now is on the life of the ownership of a 2 or 3-wheeler, electric is cheaper. But the problem is still have a high upfront cost because of the battery price. So the innovations that are getting us excited are, for example, battery swapping. The batteries represent 40% of the cost of a vehicle. If you take the battery out of the vehicle, and you create charging stations where people can go under 2 minutes, swap the batteries, 2 things happen. Number one, you reduce the cost from $1,100 for an e-bike to $600. That's cheaper than combustion engine, and sometimes can be as low as $300. So you have removed the upfront cost. But number 2, you've addressed the issue about charging downtown and access to charging. Under 2 minutes, you can swap your batteries, not 4 hours. That means if you need that vehicle to earn a living, it's not costing you money to charge from a downtown point. And finally, you no longer worry about range anxiety because you can swap under 2 minutes and get a range of 70 kilometers for 70 cents. So once again, you're saving money, you're saving emissions, and lowering your upfront capex. And just like a place like India, 17 million 2 and 3-wheelers are bought every year. 2 3-wheelers represent 1/3 of all road emissions. This is large. Now, again, it's not the trucks, it's not the Teslas, but that's where the people are and that's what they use for a living. When you talk about now the built environment, it's really about transport in terms of efficiency. How can you really minimize heat losses in buildings and drive efficiency in that side? Again, the lens is, if you drive efficiency, I save you money and put money in your pocket. So we are aligned in that transition. Finally, in the food and ag space, there are things more on the adaptation side, which is with the rising temperatures, for example, in seeds, what can you do to drive drought resistance? What can you do to minimize the need of nitrogen-based fertilizers or reduce emissions when you're planting for rice? For us, more I would say in the ag inputs, and the other parties in terms of the cold storage for the ag chain. How do you make sure that once the farmer produces something, it doesn't turn into methane by going to waste? So this is the cold chain, and ag inputs is in the food and ag space. But across all these sectors, what gets me excited is those technologies already exist and are proven. There are companies that make money. All we need to do is what I call rinse and repeat. How do you do it at scale to expand reach and affordability?
And so the scale and the possibility is tremendous, right?
Yes, actually, we published research jointly with Temasek and CGAB last year that talked about the $3 trillion opportunity in this transition. And just for mobility in Asia in itself, it's a $1.1 trillion opportunity today. And this is not rocket science, this is applicable business models that can be deployed profitably in our markets, lower emissions, and save customers money.
So for all of us with a heart on investing, this is something that we should get excited about.
And a mind on investing.
And
And
mind
mind
on
on money
women.
too. Like this is win-win as an investor and for the planet and the consumer. It's
Okay.
all three.
Triple win. We
Yes,
like that.
yeah.
We like that. Bertrand, any solutions you are particularly excited about?
There are so many of them, but I give you a few examples. You can build today, instead of putting big iron armatures in the concrete, you put fibers of steel included in the concrete, mixed in the concrete. You have buildings or tunnels or bridges that use 40% less concrete, much less steel. It is more profitable, it is cleaner, more efficient. When I speak to big corporations who are constructing, they have no idea of it. They never heard about it. No, it's strange. When you speak about heat pumps, people still believe it's only for little houses in the suburbs. No, today you can drill geothermia like a spider, you know, it goes not straight like this, but with an angle, which means that you can install heat pumps for huge buildings in the center of cities on the space of a parking slot. And you use 80% less energy. And in winter, you get the heat from the ground, and in summer, you take the heat from the building and you put it in the ground. You can put this in every building in Singapore. You know, you can build with this Dramix steel fiber. You can have systems in the domotic that manage the life in the building in a way that it is carbon neutral, energy neutral. It's a little bit more expensive in the upfront investment, and the return on investment is done after 5 years. So we don't do it, and we lose money every day. You know, each time you hear we're producing CO2, you have to associate it to the next sentence, so it means that we also lose money. This is the reality of the world. So it's economic and ecologic at the same time. And I can just advise you to go on the solarimpulse.com website. It's open source. You have all the other solutions for all the sectors, and you can use them.
So an amazing library of possibilities and solutions. What I would like to do, and I'm going to close off the panel now so that we also give Kelvin a chance to catch his flight. So I would like to thank everybody so much for being here. We're going to be back to take a few questions from the audience with the panelists who are still around. But let me maybe just sort of share what I've taken away, and I'm learning from our good friend Gillian from MAS on how to close a panel. She closed hers on 5 M's. I'm going to close mine on 5 I's. Mine is innovation. I took away innovation is critical, and we can be confident there's ample innovation out there, ample solutions that are ready to be deployed and scaled. I heard about integrity, right? The fact that it should not just be environmentally impactful, but also economically feasible. So we need to make sure we have that second eye around integrity as well. We need integration. So along the value chains, make sure everybody is along with us and runs along. We need infrastructure for certain solutions. So not just the solution itself, but also the ecosystem around it. And lastly, we need investment, and we can be excited about the investment. So my 5 I's are here with this. Thank you all so much for being part of this. And I think I would invite everybody for a quick group photo so that we can have that. And then we would open the floor again to some of the audience questions. Thank you.
Ah, on va continuer. On va être en contact, Suleiman, ça c'est sûr.
Don't mind. I'll shift the table back one so they can count in front of the table.
Oh,
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
So you're going to go extend investment and about the latter.
Don't mind.
We're going to make it fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
It starts with inspiration. Everything starts with inspiration. But it's not
Thank you for listening. No problem.
That was a great finish. Super. Ah oui, on va continuer. Hein. Thank you so much. No problem. So we'll take some questions.
Some questions, yeah?
So with this, thank you so much for bearing with us. We would like to open the floor and see whether there's any questions from the audience to my esteemed panelists. Please don't be shy. This is your chance to ask Bertrand, Vijay, or Sule to answer any questions you might have.
I actually have a question for Bertrand.
Go ahead.
I would love to know about what's your next challenge?
The next challenge is to have a hydrogen-powered airplane that will fly around the world zero emission and non-stop. And I think it's important, after what we've said on hydrogen, on innovation that needs subsidies, that needs time frame and so on, we have to give the desire to also go into these solutions that are not yet profitable. And I want to show that we can do much more than what we believe is possible. So of course we have people who say, oh, it's impossible. You cannot have a hydrogen airplane. There is no hydrogen industry. It will never happen. It's too expensive. But it's like 25 years ago at the beginning of the photovoltaic industry. It was 40 times more expensive than it is today. People thought it's a niche. It will never happen. And it reached the critical mass. That means enough offer, enough demand with the help of China, and the price dropped. And we have to do the same for hydrogen. And if we manage to fly around the world like this, I think it's going to be spectacular enough to show that hydrogen has really a potential, even for aviation.
Yeah, I'm Ram Babu from Greenco in India. We have about 8 gigawatt of renewable energy installations in India, and we are also investing into 10 gigawatt of energy storage. Because it's an affordable energy transition, I just want to say that in India, we are able to supply 24/7 RE at a cost less than a new coal-based power plant. So for an affordable energy transition, whether it is the 24/7 power or an affordable green hydrogen, the technology doesn't seem to be a challenge. The transition continues to be a challenge. For example, if I am able to supply 24/7 RE at a price comparable to coal-based power plants, who will fund the closure or assist the closing of coal-based power plants? Who will fund the transition? And similarly for hydrogen, who will ensure an appropriate carbon price so that that margin between the gray and green is filled in? And that too, when in this COP, at least we have an announcement on Article 6.4, at least that Article 6 gets operationalized quicker, and more of these developed nations takes the commitments on supporting Article 6, not just talking about their own NDCs, but supporting Article 6. Unless otherwise that they do and the carbon price is set up, the technology seems to be a smaller challenge finance availability seems to be a smaller challenge. But what is a challenge is that having an appropriate carbon price so that the movement can happen. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Anybody who would want to react to it?
I can take that. I think there's an entire suite of technologies, right, which are not, it's great to hear there are 1,700 technologies on your website which are cost effective today, right? But there's an entire suite of technologies which are not, right? Next gen batteries, next gen solar, sustainable aviation fuels, green hydrogen, different variants of hydrogen, and many more, right? And I think it's really, really critical, I think, to have subsidies earlier on in the game, right? And I think, because a carbon tax might be controversial or might be hard to implement, but I think in the US, I think the Inflation Reduction Act was such an effort to help sort of subsidize some of these new technologies out of the gate so that they can at least start scaling before they become more cost effective and commercially viable. So I think governments have a very, very important role to play. I think legislation is critical. I think you need long-term planning, right? I think the Inflation Reduction Act was an amazing piece of legislation, right? And now with the change of government in the US, I think we don't know what's going to remain, what's not. I think we need long-term planning here. I think, and absolutely both demand and supply side incentives are extremely critical, especially to get those early technologies out of the door before they achieve like massive scale.
Yeah, and I think we can all be encouraged by Article 6 and the progress made. And, I think you may have been here earlier in the Singapore Pavilion to also hear about traction and the credits that we're trying to explore, whether that can be an avenue to help with that early retirement of coal and solve that conundrum of the financing equation, where we just have to also see not everybody has a carbon price. It would be in an ideal world, we would have that to help facilitate. But I think through carbon markets, at least we may be able to change the economics a bit. And hopefully this is an approach that can garner momentum, can be proven as workable, and we can help facilitate some of this for sure. Any other question? There's a question.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the innovative, use of solar for, flying aircraft. What's the efficiency when it comes to terms of efficiency? Have you been able to track, which is using the jet fuel as compared to the solar energy? And how many feet, thousands of feet can they fly? These are the questions I'm really, concerned about, and how you're able to get all of these things done.
When you fly solar or when you fly with hydrogen, you have electric motors. Electric motors allow to have 3 times more kilometers for the same amount of energy. So that's already something interesting. For the same amount of energy, you go 3 times further, because you have an efficiency that is 97% on an electric motor. You lose 3%. On a gasoline engine, internal combustion engine, you lose 80% of your energy. And this is what we really have to understand when we speak of efficiency. The world of today is a world of inefficiency, a world of waste, because we're still in the past. Badly insulated buildings, inefficient heating, cooling, and lighting, thermal engines, old industrial processes, fossil fuels. All this comes from the beginning of the oil era 120 years ago. So we need to modernize our world. And Solar Impulse was really the most modern airplane that we could build, including the lightweight. We have the size of a jumbo jet and the weight of a family car. That's why it was using so little energy. And this can be put absolutely in every sector in the world. Just look at the fact that almost 3/4 of the energy produced in the world is wasted. You know how much it costs to the world? It costs $4.6 trillion every year. That's absolutely incredible. And we continue with these old systems that waste money. So we have to wake up. We really have to wake up. So when we ask who is going to pay for the transition, it's the efficiency who is going to pay for the transition. It's the fact that we stop to waste energy, resources, CO2, and money. This is going to pay for the transition. And this will create more equality. It will be more integrative for all the countries, the North, the South. You know, the poorest countries, they lose money every year and become poorer and poorer every year because they have to spend foreign currencies to buy fossil fuels. And at the end of the year, there's nothing left. They have to start again. If you put some money as an investment, upfront investment, into solar panels, into wind turbines, into geothermia, into biomass, into hydroelectricity, wind power, at the end of the year, you still have the infrastructure that is producing. And it produces much cheaper than with coal, gas, or oil, as it was said for India. So the problem is not technological, the problem is not financial, the problem is the human psychology. All these people who want to continue to do the same as usual, not changing anything, keep the status quo, be lazy, have a lot of inertia, have the world paralyzed by the past. It's human being the problem, nothing else.
Any other questions, Keith?
So very encouraging, and I think it's a huge injection of optimism and positivity in terms of some of the, to Sully, your words, green discounted technologies that are absolutely at cost parity. I guess the question is, if we think about it to today's topic, affordability, and assuming that we can double down on the technologies that are efficient and affordable, where do you think we can reap market efficiencies and avoid different countries or different markets competing with each other in producing the same technologies, but rather fostering more collaboration across markets? If I think about EVs, for example, you have the example of China, right, doing a lot to drive, right, both the production but also the deployment. But inevitably, do other markets then therefore become a price taker? So how do we sort of work together across the markets? Which markets should be as part of the entire value chain on these affordable and accessible technologies? What is the role that individual markets should play as we foster more collaboration and therefore make these technologies much more efficient and affordable for all markets in an equitable fashion? I suppose that's quite a big systems level question, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Happy to chime in. First, I'm not a policymaker, right? But look, when you think about all the areas that have a tipping point, you know, those building blocks of the transition, they all benefit from a cost down that has been driven by economies of scale thanks to China and demand from Europe and the US, right? So batteries, motors, and solar panels, right? And wind blades. They've all had size matters in this transition for many because it's like capital intensive industries where you need to have a learning curve and you need to have the Ford Model T of production. So I think for any of these innovations, you got to go from the first of a kind and nth of a kind, where you have large domestic demand or large offtake. So I think size matters, and I think you got to have clusters, right? So I think that's true. You do need to have clusters. And what I always say is, what we need is a Silicon Valley for the transition, right? The challenge we have is this: is Bertrand and I just realized today we should spend a lot more time together. But no, we meet once a year at COP. It should be over lunch on a Tuesday. Now, if we actually had an epicenter where you had the whole capital stack, the innovation, we say, well, here's a challenge. How can we find a third way to innovate to finance? Then you're going to have a higher rate of innovation and problem solving. So the issue we have first is we are dispersed in our mission. First, how can you create a cluster from a human capital stack and innovation? Second is you've got to have a cluster of demand to have economies of scale. But I think once you get to the cost down, let's say solar, battery motors, then what's really important, I will call it, is the go-to-market and how do you serve that customer. And every customer is different. Like I am from Senegal. I say that Bangladesh is from Guinea. The way they need to have a use case for solar energy and how I do my go-to-market, how do I define the product, how do I price it, how do I market it, how do I push, is going to be so different from how I'm going to do it in Switzerland. Just like how I sell Nescafe in Senegal is by the sachet, how I sell Nescafe in Sweden is going to be by the Nescafe pods. So I think for me, we have the transition from, yes, produce it at scale to have the cost down, but producing it from the factory doesn't take it to your house. What takes to your house is an entrepreneur and a business model, right? So I think we need to think about that business model innovation, and that's where you really have to harness local entrepreneurs to define the product, their customer, and make it compelling to the customer. So I think you need to do two things then. You've got to have a cluster of innovation, build the Silicon Valley. You've got to have cost down by having economies of scale, so you have the cost down. But the third leg, to bring it to the consumer to change that behavior, that's where you have business model innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think that's more localized.
I will add something about the competition between the countries and between the continents. If you compete with the same rules, competition is good because it motivates each one to be better and cheaper. But if you don't have the same rules, it does not work. And what we notice is that Europe is now introducing a carbon border tax to compensate the difference of the rules. And I think this makes it much better. Because if a country is producing cheap because they treat their workers badly or because they have no ecological rules and they don't care about carbon emissions, when this product arrives in Europe, which has human rules, which has working rules, which has environmental rules, there is a distortion of competitivity. And this cannot happen. And this is where you have to put some measures to compensate this distortion. Because competition is good, but distortion is not.
Great. I think you've been very generous with your time, so thank you very much. I would like to close off with a very last rapid-fire question. We're at COP29. We will be looking to COP30 next year. Anything that you would like to see change over the next year? What is your one thing that you hope, when we come together at COP30 next year, is going to be different? Bertrand, do you want to go?
I would like people to understand that there are more solutions than problems, that it is profitable and not expensive to fix climate change, that it's not only a question of decarbonization, but a question of modernization, to have modern infrastructure, modern energy sources, that it is an opportunity to become more efficient, and that we should be much more optimistic in the way we enter into the climate action and not resist as if it was a burden, but go with excitement in the climate action because it's an advantage.
Vijay?
So I see as a whole, we're in a massive AI hype cycle. But as I think we were talking about earlier as well with Suleiman, right? I think that's sort of taking the focus away from, some of the focus away from climate tech. I think there's a massive supply-demand mismatch of capital for new emerging climate technologies. And there's an entire suite of them. Would love to see a reduction in the supply-demand mismatch before the next COP.
Sule, your wish list?
I think for me, it ties to both points, which is how do we make sure that actually we show to people that there are solutions that exist today that make their lives better today? Because I think now we have this gap in inspiration. So when I talk to some of my friends, they tell me about how their children are learning how to code. I hope next year they tell me how their child learning more about, electromechanics and electrons, because they don't think that it's an opportunity for them to improve their lives, but I think coding is. So for me, it is the gap between solutions that exist today that can make everybody's lives better and really, stimulate us. And I hope that the next COP will be really not just about the science and the finance, but actually what exists today that makes our lives better and that's tangible.
Thank you so much. It's been very inspirational. We have another I added to the list, so thank you so much to my panelists with a lot of gratitude. Thank you to the audience for being with us here today. And with this, we conclude today's session. Thank you so much.
Please join me in giving our speakers a warm round of applause. We will now be taking a short break. Please take the time to stretch,